In the spring of 1967, as the Middle East stood on the edge of another full-blown war, a very different kind of battle had already begun. Long before the first airstrike, before a single tank crossed a border, Israel had already infiltrated the Syrian war machine, not with weapons but with words.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Radio waves, to be specific. This was the Damascus transmission, a psychological deception operation that unfolded silently across the airwaves. Israeli intelligence, knowing Syria's military heavily relied on intercepted communications, decided not to hide their plans but to fake them. They began crafting false radio transmissions that sounded exactly like real Israeli military chatter. Every detail was painstakingly designed to appear authentic, down to the call signs, timing, and structure. The messages portrayed an Israeli army that was struggling. Miscommunications between units, slow supply lines, faulty equipment, weak points in the defensive line. It was all fiction, but believable fiction. The kind that doesn't raise alarms, just quietly shapes decisions. And Syria was listening. Their entire military intelligence strategy leaned heavily on signal interception. If they could monitor Israeli broadcasts, they believed they could predict Israeli moves. What they didn't realize was that they were being fed a completely fabricated script. That overconfidence in their own intel was exactly what Israeli intelligence counted on. As the false broadcasts rolled in, Syrian commanders began adjusting their defenses. They sent reinforcements to sectors Israel had intentionally made to look vulnerable. They deprioritized routes and zones that seemed stable. They thought they were gaining the upper hand, identifying Israeli mistakes in real time. But every move they made brought them further away from the actual threat. On the Israeli side, the operation was unfolding flawlessly. The fake transmissions weren't just confusing the Syrians, they were shaping their entire battle plan, and the Israelis were watching it unfold. As Syrian units were redirected and strongholds were left unguarded, Israeli planners knew exactly where the real weak spots were, because they'd created them. When the actual fighting began, Israeli forces didn't just attack, they exploited. They surged through positions Syria believed to be safe where vigilance had been relaxed. They bypassed zones reinforced due to fake intel. And within days, Syrian defenses crumbled faster than anyone expected. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological collapse. Syria didn't lose because they lacked resources or manpower. They lost because their intelligence had been poisoned. The damage wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in the minds of commanders who had acted with full confidence in data that turned out to be fabricated. The realization wasn't just painful, it was destabilizing. The most devastating part? Syria had no idea the operation had even occurred until the damage was done. The deception had been seamless. The transmissions sounded routine, mundane, unremarkable, exactly how real military chatter should sound. There were no red flags, no obvious flaws, just the steady hum of a false reality playing out across the radio waves. In the aftermath of the war, Syria was forced to reckon with this failure on every level. Their trust in intercepted communications was shattered. Signals intelligence went from being their greatest asset to their most scrutinized weakness. Military reforms followed. Protocols were rewritten to include stricter verification measures. Analysts were trained to question the authenticity of intercepted data, not just decode it. Sophistication became the new requirement. Blind trust was no longer an option. Western militaries took notice too. Intelligence agencies across the globe began studying the operation as a model of electronic warfare, not just for how it was pulled off, but for how surgical, subtle, and psychologically effective it had been. It wasn't brute force, it was belief manipulation, strategic misdirection wrapped in technical expertise. And that's what made it so haunting. This wasn't about flashy technology or overwhelming might. It was about exploiting human behavior. Israeli intelligence understood how Syrian decision-makers interpreted information, and they weaponized that understanding. The operation revealed a terrifying truth. In modern warfare, it doesn't matter if your intel is encrypted, fast, or abundant. If it's false and you believe it, you've already lost. That's what makes the Damascus transmission such a turning point. It shifted the definition of warfare from territory and troop count to information and perception. and it showed that with the right psychological tools you can dismantle an entire military strategy without firing a single shot. When the real attack came, the Syrians were out of position, out of sync, and completely unprepared for the reality on the ground. They'd been playing a different war, a war shaped by fake information, a war written for them by their enemy. The fallout wasn't just strategic, it was deeply personal. Syrian soldiers had fought under the assumption that they were defending vital ground. They were told the Israeli forces they were facing were disorganized and stretched thin. When the truth revealed itself, when the Israeli military proved far more cohesive and devastating than expected, the disillusionment hit hard. Morale fractured, trust eroded, commanders questioned the very systems they were trained to rely on. The Golan Heights, once considered impenetrable, had fallen not because of superior force, but because the defenders had been misled from the very beginning. Their belief in faulty intelligence was the first breach. And even though Israel's deception campaign ended with the fighting, its consequences continued to ripple outward. In the years that followed, electronic warfare became a pillar of strategic planning. Militaries began asking harder questions. What if the enemy wants us to hear this? What if what seems like a gift of insight is actually bait? What if our greatest source of information is a Trojan horse? Because that's exactly what it was. The Damascus transmission was a psychological Trojan horse, and Syria opened the gates without hesitation. Today, the lessons from this operation are more relevant than ever. In an age of AI-generated content, manipulated data, and digital warfare, the line between truth and falsehood is constantly under attack. And as more militaries invest in faster, smarter, more connected networks, they also increase their exposure to deception. The battlefield has changed. Information is no longer just support, it's the fight itself. Control the signal and you control the war. What the Damascus transmission proved is that warfare isn't just about dominance, it's about narrative. And if your opponent writes the story you think you're reading, you've already lost the plot. If you're still here, you know this wasn't just a story about one war, it's a warning. If that shook your understanding of how wars are won, hit that like button. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this the height of strategic brilliance or a dangerous precedent for the future of warfare? And subscribe for more stories that pull back the curtain on the tactics history almost forgot. Because in today's world, the truth doesn't always come through clearly, and sometimes what you hear is exactly what they want you to believe. So here's the cold reality that the Damascus transmission made impossible to ignore. In modern warfare, the truth is negotiable. The game changed when Israel proved you don't need to outgun your enemy, you just need to make them think they've outsmarted you. That's exactly what they did to Syria in the weeks leading up to the Six-Day War. And they didn't do it with weapons or espionage in the traditional sense. They did it with sound, with chatter, with fake, boring, meticulously crafted radio transmissions that sounded so routine, so convincing, that Syria's military couldn't tell the difference between reality and a trap. And the trap closed fast. These weren't clumsy disinformation campaigns. These were engineered messages built from deep technical insight, designed not to confuse but to convince. Israel's signals intelligence knew exactly how Syrian surveillance worked, what frequencies they monitored, what their analysts looked for, even how their officers processed intercepted data and which patterns they prioritized. They used that knowledge to drip-feed Syria a fictional version of Israeli weakness, just subtle enough to be accepted as real. Syria took the bait, and not just once. They structured an entire defensive strategy around what they thought was solid intel. That's the kind of mistake that doesn't just cost battles, it rewrites the entire trajectory of a war. Syria responded to the fake broadcasts by repositioning units, reinforcing decoy vulnerabilities, and leaving actual Israeli targets dangerously underprotected. They moved according to Israel's script. Without knowing it, they were planning their own collapse. And here's the thing, this wasn't random luck on Israel's part, this was planned down to the minute. Every message had a purpose. Every fake communication was part of a calculated map. This was warfare that didn't depend on who had more troops or better weapons. It hinged on who could better manipulate perception. And by the time Syrian forces realized that they'd been fed a lie, the real war had already begun. In the Golan Heights, terrain that favored defenders, terrain Syria had fortified for years, Israeli forces punched through with speed that defied expectations. Not because the defenses were inherently flawed, but because they were misdirected. Strongholds had been reinforced in the wrong places. Critical zones were left exposed. The Israeli military moved quickly, strategically, with the full awareness that they were entering a battlefield that had already been softened, not by artillery, but by illusion. What makes the Damascus transmission so devastating isn't just what it achieved, but how effortlessly it slipped under the radar. There were no dramatic announcements, no high-tech disruption, just a few fake voices on a frequency Syria trusted. And the result? A collapse that looked from the outside like tactical brilliance. But behind the scenes, it was a slow-burning psychological operation that had been detonating long before the first shot was fired. When the dust settled, it was clear to both sides that this wasn't just another chapter in Israel's military history. It was a masterclass in preemptive psychological warfare. And for Syria, it was a humiliation. Post-war, Syrian officials were forced to confront a brutal truth. They had been outplayed not in combat but in cognition. Their faith in intercepted signals, the very cornerstone of their intelligence operations, had been used against them. Their trusted frequencies had become channels for deception. It was a betrayal of the senses. Their ears, their analysts, their decisions, everything had been manipulated. The fallout was immediate. Syria began to overhaul its signals intelligence infrastructure. Verification became a central pillar. Messages were no longer acted upon without additional confirmation. Redundancies were introduced to ensure that intercepted transmissions weren't just authentic sounding, but cross-verified against independent intelligence. Doubt, once dismissed, became doctrine. But the damage couldn't be undone. The lesson had been absorbed painfully and permanently. Meanwhile, in war colleges and intelligence communities across the world, the Damascus transmission was dissected with reverence, not just for its flawless execution but for its strategic implications. Because if you could win a war with this, with signals and suggestion, why would you rely solely on tanks and bullets? It redefined what warfare could look like in the modern age. From that point forward, deception wasn't a side tactic. It became central to strategic planning. Psychological operations evolved. Signals intelligence units didn't just listen, they created. Misinformation became a currency, and the battlefield expanded from land, sea, and air to bandwidth. And now, decades later, the lessons of that operation still echo. In a world that runs on data and signal transmission, the tactics behind the Damascus transmission are more relevant than ever. Every military, every government, every cyber warfare division is now acutely aware that perception is as important as position. What makes it even more chilling is the knowledge that this kind of operation didn't rely on technology that was particularly futuristic. It was based on an understanding of human behavior, of trust, of expectation, and it weaponized those things without ever needing to breach a perimeter or deploy a drone. It played out in plain sight, or rather in plain sound. And once you start thinking about warfare in those terms, everything changes. Because if a few fake radio messages could reroute an entire army in 1967, what could that look like now? When communications are digital, when networks are global, when algorithms help make targeting decisions, what happens if someone slips a false signal into those systems? The scary truth is this: the tools have evolved, but the vulnerability is still the same. Belief, trust, assumption. What Israel proved in the days leading up to the Six-Day War is that if you can control what your enemy believes, you don't need to control what they do. They'll sabotage themselves. And that is what makes the Damascus transmission one of the most quietly dangerous operations in military history. It didn't just win a war, it reshaped how wars are fought. If you've made it this far, you're probably thinking what everyone thinks when they first learn about this: how is this not more widely known? How does something this precise, this powerful, not dominate every textbook and documentary? The answer is simple: it didn't look like a traditional victory. There were no parades for fake broadcasts, no footage of staged transmissions. It happened behind the curtain, and its success was almost too clean. It left no physical trace, just shattered assumptions and redrawn defense lines. But those effects were real, they were decisive, and they marked a shift that still shapes warfare to this day. The silence after the Damascus transmission was louder than any explosion. There were no viral clips, no intercepted recordings that played out for the world to hear. The operation was quiet by design, no trace, no signature, no glory, just the slow unraveling of an enemy's defense line as they walked deeper into a reality someone else had scripted for them. That's what made it so dangerous. The Syrians didn't lose because they underestimated Israel's strength. They lost because they overestimated their understanding of Israel's position. And that miscalculation wasn't a failure of intelligence gathering, it was the result of an intelligence operation so precise, so intimately tailored to Syria's habits that it turned their strengths into blind spots. Let's be honest, this wasn't about flashy maneuvers or last-minute heroics. This was cold, clinical manipulation. Israeli signals intelligence officers didn't just fool the Syrian military. They mapped out how Syrian analysts think, then fed them just enough confirmation to make them confident in the wrong conclusions. And that's why the collapse happened so fast once the war began. The battlefront wasn't the problem, the decisions behind the lines had already been compromised. You could see it in the way Syrian forces responded. They weren't just reacting to enemy fire, they were reacting to confusion. Positions they thought were secure fell instantly. Zones they believed were vulnerable stayed quiet. And as Israeli tanks pushed forward, the Syrian response lagged behind not because of cowardice or poor training, but because their war map didn't match the battlefield in front of them. And in warfare, when your expectations don't match your reality, you start to panic. That panic spread fast. Commanders stopped trusting reports. Soldiers began questioning orders. Some areas held out longer than others, but the psychological fracture had already set in. The Syrian military was fighting with a broken compass, and Israel had been the one to snap it weeks earlier from a radio tower miles away. Even after the ceasefire, the sting didn't fade. Syria had to live with the knowledge that they hadn't just been outfought, they'd been outthought. Their intelligence community had to admit it had been manipulated by false signals. Not just tricked but used. And when you base your defense strategy on lies you didn't recognize as lies, it cuts deeper than any battlefield loss. They rebuilt, of course. Protocols changed. Systems became more cautious. Signals were no longer blindly accepted, they were questioned, verified, cross-checked. But the damage wasn't just structural, it was emotional. A permanent reminder that no matter how much you hear, you still might not know the truth. Meanwhile, other nations quietly took notes, not just on how Israel executed the deception, but on how effective it was to shape a war before the first shot. The new arms race wasn't just about missiles and jets, it was about narrative, about shaping what the enemy believes before they ever see you coming. And that race hasn't stopped. If this story left you stunned or gave you a new way to think about warfare, tap that like button. Share it with someone who still thinks victory is only measured in firepower. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this the pinnacle of military strategy or did it cross a line? And if you want more behind-the-curtain stories like this, subscribe now. Because when the next war starts, it might not begin with an invasion. It might begin with a whisper. And by the time you realize what's happening, the map may already be a lie.